like that.
Wow.
So there we go. We are learning 48 steps, 48 qualities, 48 requirements, 48 tools in order to be able to learn Torah. That's the theme. And 48 is a lot. So we're going to divide them into clusters, try and group together the things that are related to each other. And that way we'll do them not over 48 weeks, and hopefully not even over 10 weeks. We'll see how we go. So the first cluster is practical. If a person wants to be able to learn Torah, then a person has to use certain practical skills, right, in order to be able to learn Torah. I think we're going to have to, you know what we really need? We need another camera in the room right now to catch everybody's expressions when they walk in and say, what happened over here? So we're going to start off talking about practical things. What do you think is the most practical thing that you need to do in order to learn? Is to learn. Yes, of course, you have to have something. You have to have material to learn. But the most obvious thing is that you have to learn. And so it's not a surprise that it starts off with a word, but Talmud. That's the first word that we're going to learn. But Talmud. That in order to learn, you have to learn. Doesn't sound like that's a major innovation. But I just want to go through the cluster first. We'll identify what the elements of the cluster are, and then we'll unpack them. So it's Talmud, through study, Bishmias ha'oizen, listening with your ear. Okay, what else were you going to listen with? Right? Ba'arichas sifosayim, by expressing, I'm going to keep it very generic, expressing with your lips, okay, and bebinas halev, with understanding of the heart, with an ayin, yeah, okay, and the last one is bebinas halev, with an understanding of the heart. So that's a cluster of the elements that a person is supposed to do or use when they're actually learning. The next cluster, which hopefully I'm expecting that we'll get through as well today, is more an attitude, like what your sentiment, what your emotional state has to be when you learn. That will be the next cluster. But this sounds like a really practical series of things that you have to do. So let's start at the beginning with the word Talmud. So it does sound like a little bit, unnecessary. If you're telling me that I have to learn, then it makes sense that Talmud means to learn. So what is the implication of that expression Talmud? Quite a number of the commentaries on this Mishnah tell us that Talmud reminds us to be a student. Talmud is to be on the receiving end. So there'd be the melamed, the person who is actively teaching, and then you'll have the person who is the talmid, and that's the verb Talmud, is to be in a state of being a talmid, to be somebody who's learning rather than what? What's the alternative? What's the alternative? The alternative is where a person thinks that they are the master. And the person believes, I've got this, I've understood this, I've worked this one out, we can put it to bed, I've dealt with it. And this relates a little bit, if you remember, to the previous chapter, where we spoke about the 7 characteristics of a wise person versus the 7 characteristics of the golem, the so-called fool. And one of those characteristics was that the golem says, Masha Shama Oimer Shomaiti. Right? That was the reverse. That whatever I've heard, I believe I know. So Talmud is the opposite of that. Talmud is, I'm always in a state of learning. There is no such thing as being a master. There is no such thing as being able to turn around and say, guess what? I'm done with this. It's over. If you have a look at what we do at the Siyum when we conclude a tractate, a Masechta of Gemara, what do we call it? What's the alternate name for a Siyum? Anybody know? The alternate name for a Siyum, it's actually the more correct term, for the end of a Masechta, the end of a tractate of Gemara. What's the correct term? A Hadron. Hadron is from the sentence that you say at the end of studying a tractate of Gemara. You say, Hadron Aloch. That means we're going to return to you. It's an incredible insight, because here's somebody who's spent X amount of time learning through a Masechta, a whole tractate of Gemara, which quite frankly is not easy, and it's going to take a lot of time, it's going to take a lot of investment, it's going to take a lot of exploration, investigation. You get to the end of it, the average person, when they have concluded a period of learning, will be quite chuffed with themselves and say, look at me, look how well I did. Let's make a siyum, the conclusion. Let's put this on the shelf and take out the next volume. What do we say? Hadran alach. The very first statement at the end of concluding a section is to say, I will come back and revisit and relearn it again. So that's Talmud, that the person should always be in a state of being the student. I'll tell you a story on that note. If I'm not mistaken, I believe that the story happened to a rabbi called Rabbi Zalman Shimon Dvorkin. I'm pretty sure that's who the story was with. He was the posek in Crown Heights in New York in the 70s. He was the posek. So he was once away. I don't know exactly where he was. He was away from his office, away from his study. And somebody phoned wherever he was. Remember, this is the days before cell phones. Some people don't know that there was such an age. So they phoned wherever he was staying. Somebody had a particular shayla. And it wasn't the most complex, sophisticated shayla. It was just a question, a very straightforward question on an issue in halacha. And he said to this person, I'm afraid I can't answer you right now because I'm not in my study and I don't have access to my sforim. I don't have access to the resource material to be able to look up your shayla. The person said, but surely this is the kind of thing that you get to hear on a semi-regular basis. I don't think it was as simple as, the milk spoon and the meat pot. But it was something that he didn't believe was the most complex shayla. It was a shayla. He says, I can't answer you. So the fellow says, but I really need an answer. It's a pressing issue and I've got to work it out. So he says, okay, phone me back in 10 minutes. Fine. So the eyewitness who was with this rabbi at this time says what happens next is he picks up the phone and phones his wife at home. He says to his wife, do me a favor, go to my bookshelf. On this particular section of bookshelves, you'll see the 5th shelf from the top, the 3rd book from the left. Can you take out that book? So she goes, she gets the book, comes back to the phone. He says, okay, have you got that book? Fine. Open the book to page X. She opens to page X. Go down to the 3rd paragraph and read to me what it says there. So she goes, she reads the paragraph. He says, thank you very much. That's what I needed. The person phones back and he gives the answer to the shayla. So the eyewitness who was watching this says, I don't understand. You obviously knew the answer. Not only did you know the answer, you knew exactly where it's written. Why didn't you just give him an answer? So he said, because that's not how Torah works. It's not that you become the repository of information. The way that a person gets to know what the Torah says is to constantly remain in a state of Talmud. You're always learning. It's not your information. You don't master information. You've got to always go back to the source as a student and ensure that what you're sharing is accurate and aligned with the source. That's what the mission is telling us over here. But Talmud, the first step out of 48 steps of how a person is going to learn Torah, and I don't want to use the word master now in that context, but the way that a person will successfully learn Torah, the very first step is to remember Talmud. This is a process of ongoing study. Hashem's wisdom is infinite. We are just human, and none of us can ever turn around with that satisfaction of saying, I now know everything that there is to know about this particular subject. And even when we do know, we have to retain, and we'll see later, the humility is going to be a big part of this. We have to retain that sense of being a student of Torah in order to go back and ensure that what we're learning is, as we say, aliba de emes, is aligned with the truth of Torah. Incidentally, that's why the term that we use for our greatest scholars, I don't think people necessarily stop and think about this, but the term that we use for our greatest scholars is Talmidei Chachamim, which really translates as the students of the sages. So you could have somebody who we think we're giving the greatest compliment to somebody by saying they're a tremendous Talmid Chacham, and we believe that accolade is to say they are the master. Really what we're saying is they are the ultimate student. That's the greatest state that a person could be in, is to be the ultimate student of Torah, Talmud. That's the first step out of 48 steps towards acquiring Torah. The next step, he says, is Shmias ha'oizen, listening with your ear. What does that mean, listening with your ear? What does that mean? I can tell you in today's world, it certainly means not to record. Because there are different layers of tech that we have that allow us not to listen, right? So one of those is, I always get this, I'm sure you've seen this happen multiple times, is the shir going to be recorded? Is the shir going to be recorded? And my favorite response is, I don't think so. Even if I know it's going to be recorded. Because the moment people know that there's a recording, you naturally don't, you have to listen. It's fine, I'll listen afterwards. If there's something I didn't catch in the shir, I'll listen to the recording afterwards and I'll catch it up. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's bad to have recordings, because that also allows us the opportunity to review. We just have to be very conscious of the fact that when we have a crutch to lean on, then we don't listen to our ears anymore. Shmi'as ha'oizen, so I think it's the Maharal who says, Shmi'as ha'oizen means that what you've got to ensure is that you're actually listening to every word while it's being taught. Because sometimes one word out of sync can become a whole misinterpretation of the message. The story of the guy who says you should never read self-help books because one misprint can ruin your life. It's a similar kind of thing. One mishearing of a word can be devastating. And let me tell you, I'm sure every rabbi, every rebbitzin, anybody who's ever given a shir in their life can tell you at least one story of a person who came back to them sometime down the line and said, you said X. And you know for a fact, you never said that. In fact, what he's illustrating to us is that it's quite normal for people to come with a particular bias. That's how we approach everything in life. And when we have a particular bias, we tend to have selective hearing. So we all think it's just our teenage children who have selective hearing. We all have selective hearing. I once saw a cartoon where it's this wife who's clearly very upset at her husband, and she's giving him a whole drosha. You never help. You're not available. You're always running off to business meetings. You're doing this, like a whole litany of things. And at the end she says, and all you want is to go play golf. And all he hears is, go play golf. So, selective hearing, it's part of the human condition. Shmi'as ha'oizen does not just mean to listen with our ears. We have multiple words in Hebrew that we can use for listening. For example, the most direct word for listening is leha'azin, from the word oizen, which means you're employing your ear. That is the function of listening. Shmi'ah is not listening with the ear. Shmi'ah is focused listening. That's why we say Shema Yisrael. We don't say ha'azenu or ha'azinu Yisrael. It's interesting, it's in the singular. Right? We don't say ha'azain, lend me your ears. We say Shema. Shema is to listen with focus and with intention. Shmi'as ha'oizen means to ensure that what we're listening to, we're listening attentively to the information. That way we make sure that whatever's coming our way in terms of what we're being taught is not going to be either corrupted or somehow mixed in with our own biases, but we're actually hearing what's being said. And so that's why the idea is to pay attention not only to the content, but to the language that is used to deliver that content. And we know that, we certainly see it in the written word, that when things are written either in Mishnah and of course in the actual Tanakh itself, but even in Gemara, even in Midrash, which is not as literal, the choice of words is always absolutely accurate. So we've got to pay attention to those words. Not only that, the Gemara tells us that when Talmidei Chachamim speak, when real scholars talk, then even sichas chulin, even their ordinary mundane conversation, tzricha limud, is something that we're supposed to learn from. Shmi'as ha'oizen means to actually listen out for things or the way in which sages speak, because that in itself is a lesson. I'll give you an illustration. The Gemara in Pesachim has this fascinating section about how to talk and how not to speak, and I'm going to link this immediately to the next one as well, Arichas Sefosayim. Because one of the interpretations of Arichas Sefosayim is that it has absolutely nothing to do with when we're learning, it has to do with the rest of the time. Arichas Sefosayim makes sure that our lips are What's arichas? Like the word Shulchan Aruch, right? Something that is set in a very specific, deliberate, intentional way. So arichas sefosayim is not only that when we're learning Torah, we should say the words of Torah, which is the most common explanation, but we must make sure that the words that come out of our mouths normally are very carefully chosen. That goes together with this idea of Shmi'as ha'ozen. Listen how the sages speak, and that will teach us how we should speak. So the Gemara in Pesachim has this whole section which talks about what things a person should or shouldn't say. That's the core of the principle that we don't speak negatively, right? That's the Gemara that talks about that you don't speak negatively. And it gives these fascinating, firstly, quotations from the Torah, and then examples of the sages. So, for example, it tells us that in Parshas Noach, when Hashem wants Noach to get all of the animals, he says he's got to gather the animals which are tahira, the animals that are pure, and then the animals asher einena tahira, the animals that are not classified as pure. Why doesn't it just say hatmeya, the impure animals? Says the Gemara. The Torah wanted to use a whole string of extra letters to teach us that you should rather speak in a positive way. If it's possible to avoid saying something negative, avoid it. Now the word tameya is not negative, it's not malicious, it's factual. These are impure animals. And yet the Torah goes out of its way not to use that word. It kind of skirts the issue. Asher einena tahira. To teach us that we should be careful not to use negative expressions. So, Shmi'as ha'ozen, we should listen out to the sages how they speak, and from that, arichas sefosayim, then we will know how to organize our own words so we speak in the most appropriate way possible. The Gemara over there, incidentally, tells us that the way that a person speaks becomes a hint at what kind of a person they are. So, both in a positive and in a negative fashion. So that's, again, listening carefully to how people speak tells us also about who they are, and therefore that tells us whether or not we should learn from them. Like the Gemara says that the kind of person you should be learning, I shouldn't be saying this because I'm going to lose my job, but the person that you're supposed to learn from is supposed to be somebody who is like Malach Hashem Tzavoi, somebody who is literally like an angel of God. If somebody's at that caliber, then you should be listening to what they have to say. And if not, find a different teacher. So that's the end of this class. So in any event, so there the Gemara talks about, for example, that if a person constantly talks about that the fact that they want to live at the coast, this is probably half of our community, right? One day I want to live at the coast. So the Gemara says that probably indicates that they come from Zevulun, from the tribe of Zevulun, because Zevulun lechoif yamim yishkoin, because Zevulun was blessed to have cities that would be on the coast. So if it's in your DNA that you want to be at the coast, likelihood is that you come from Zevulun. That's on the very positive, right? But then on the negative, so the Gemara gives all these examples about sages who had to share bad news and how they skirted the issue in all kinds of creative ways because they didn't want to say bad news. That's, by the way, one of the reasons why we have a custom to pour out water, God forbid, when somebody passes away. So you've heard the minhag that you pour out water in the room. If there's any uncovered water, you pour it out. One of the reasons, I'm not saying it's the only reason, was that way you would get the message out that someone had passed away without having to say it. Because we don't want to express negativity. So the Gemara, they tells all these interesting stories about people who came back. You know, the one example, there were these two half-brothers and the two rabbis, and the one comes back and he says, is my father doing well? He says, your mother's doing well. He says, oh, my mother's doing well, so actually your father's doing well. So from the way that he skirted the issue, he understood that neither of them were alive, that he didn't want to say those words. And then the Gemara goes even further to speak about people who used bad language and how that was seen not only as bad language, it was seen as an indication that they had something wrong on the inside, and it had consequences. For example, the Gemara tells the story about 3 Kohanim. This sounds almost like a Jewish joke. 3 Kohanim walk into the Beis HaMikdash, right? And the part that's not a joke is they were complaining about the food. So that's a fairly Jewish pastime. And the food that they were complaining about was the lechem haponim. Remember, the lechem haponim is 12 loaves that are refreshed every week for Shabbos. And whoever the Kohanim are on duty, they get last week's loaves to eat. So it has to be divided between all of the Kohanim on duty. You don't necessarily get a fortune. So they're all complaining. One guy says, the piece of lechem haponim that I got was like a poil. A poil is a kind of a bean. And the other one says, oh, you think that's bad? The piece that I got was like an adasha. An adasha is a lentil. It's obviously much smaller. So the last guy says, well, you think that's bad? the piece that I got was a little string like the tail of a lizard. It's referring to the lechem haponim, which is one of the holiest items of all food that exists. And you're referring to it as the tail of a sheret, one of the 8 creatures that are considered impure. So they immediately launched an investigation into this guy and discovered he wasn't a kohen. So that's Shmiras HaOizen. You got to listen carefully not only to the content, but to the way in which the content is shared. Because if a person uses language that is not appropriate, they shouldn't be a teacher, or they shouldn't be your teacher. And if their precision, if their language is used with such incredible precision, then that's an indicator that you should be listening to them. And from that you learn Arichas Sefosayim, how to ensure that the way that we speak is the way that it should be. The most simple explanation of Arichas Sefosayim is that we say the words when we're learning. The big difference between a yeshiva and a library. So you go into a university library, you can have a good shlof. You walk into a yeshiva, you feel like you're at the shuk. Why? Because Arichas Sefosayim, so the Rambam talks about this, that when you speak the words while you're learning Torah, it is one of the best memory techniques. There's a certain cognitive process when you actually say words aloud that helps you to retain the information. Whereas if you read in a very passive way, just scanning with your eyes, you don't have that same cognitive process. So Arichas Sefosayim is to tell us, how does a person acquire Torah? Well, one of the key things is to actually say the words when we're learning Torah. But it's not just to say the words. Arichas Sefosayim is to make sure that we say the words correctly. Because often what happens is, we go back, we've learned something, we're very excited because we've learned it, we now want to share it with other people. We want to share it at the Shabbos table, because it's a little better than all the other things people tend to discuss at the Shabbos table, right? So we're going to share some Torah. And unfortunately, sometimes if we don't get a nuance right, we may think we're conveying the message, we may in fact be conveying a completely different message. So Arichas Sefosayim also means to ensure that what we are sharing, what we are quoting, we're quoting accurately. Now, if you have a look, unfortunately, across the Jewish community, we seem to be very good at recreating what sources say. You know, like for example, I mean, I don't know why this is on my head, other than the fact maybe that somebody mentioned it over Shabbos, it just popped into my head. People talk about the fact that before a baby is born, the neshama chooses its family. It's a wonderful thought, but does it exist in any Jewish source? So I've got this running challenge, for the last few years, and maybe somebody's going to finally bring the proof. But show me where it says it in a sefer. So far I haven't found it, but it doesn't mean lo inu eino raya. The Gemara says if you haven't seen something, it's not a proof that it doesn't exist. But that's one of those examples, I think, of where people take something and share it in a way that is not necessarily true to the source. Here's another one. You're going to love this one. You're going to love this one. On Shabbos, the calories don't count. What's the source? Where does it say? 2 souls, it says. 100%. Let's test that. Let's test that as well. Where does it say you have 2 souls?
I don't know, but that's what you hear.
I'm asking. Where does it say you have 2 souls? What does it say? Neshama Yesera. That could mean an additional soul, or it could mean an additional depth of your soul. Who says it's another soul? Neshama Yesera, you have more soul on Shabbos. More, of who you are. More of it, right? Who said Neshama Yesera? Is that there's some other soul that pops into your body? Yeah? Right? So this is a great example of Arichas Sefosayim, making sure that what we're quoting accurately. This principle of the calories don't count on Shabbos is based on a pasuk. So there might be some, there might be some source. Pasuk says, "V'zerisi aleichem peresh chageichem." That Hashem, it's not a very complimentary pasuk. But Hashem says, I'm literally going to rub into your faces the excrement of your Yom Tovs. Okay, so from that, the Gemara says, "Peresh chageichem v'lo peresh shabbatchem," that there is waste matter on Yom Tov and there's not waste matter on Shabbos. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that you couldn't eat more and the calories don't count. It means the experience of eating normally is a very physical experience that we try to lasso into something that is spiritual. On Shabbos, there's no waste. The eating is not a physical experience in the same way as during the week. The eating itself is already spiritual, meaning to say the pleasure of food on Shabbos is service of Hashem. The pleasure on food during the rest of the week is service of self. And in order to connect it to Hashem, I have to have a bracha beforehand, and I have to focus and meditate on as they like to say in today's world, the mindfulness of eating. That's what it means. It doesn't say that there's no calories, there's no waste, or no weight. It means there's no physicality associated with the food. Okay, we could, I'm sure, discover, you can do this on Shavuos night, stay up the whole night finding misquotations that are commonly shared in the Jewish community. But the point really is that Arichas Fosain, we have to make sure that what we're quoting, we're actually quoting accurately. So what have we got so far? Talmud. We always have to make sure that the study of Torah is exactly that. It is the study of Torah. I'm the student. I'm always in a position of receiving. That's why the Pirkei Avos began, Moshe Kibel Torah. And Moshe received rather than learned or mastered or became the greatest teacher of history. He received the Torah. That's a very, I don't want to say passive, but it's certainly a very humble perspective. Then Shmiras HaOizen, to pay attention clearly that what the information we're getting is correct, and also to pay attention to how the Chachamim speak, so we can emulate that in our Arichas Fosayim, in the way that we convene our words, and to make sure that what we're quoting correctly. Then the next thing, the last part of this cluster, the Binas HaLev, that in order to acquire Torah, you need the understanding of the heart. What is Binas HaLev? What does it mean, understanding of the heart? So you might remember that when they were looking for people to be on the team to build the Mishkan, so there the Torah says that you had to go for Anashim Chachomim V'Yiduim B'Shiftechem, and then later on he says V'Amalei Yosei Ruach Elokim B'Chochma U'B'Tvuna, right? So Tvuna and Bina are very similar words. Rashi there interprets what are these different qualities that were necessary for the architects of the Mishkan. And he says that Chochma is like a trader. A trader is somebody who's waiting for material. Let's say, for example, you've got somebody who's on the diamond exchange, right? So they're waiting for somebody to bring them a lot of diamonds, and then they can go out and they can do business with it. So that's what Chochmah is compared to, meaning to say, Chochmah needs something to stimulate it. Bina, on the other hand, he says, is Mevin Davar Mitoich Davar, is somebody who can understand something from the context of something else, and that is like the person who is a merchant, where the merchant is always out and about making sure to create networks and to be able to ensure that there's always supply of materials and then customers to buy those materials. So that's the big difference between Chochmah and Bina. That's why we associate Bina with the Lev of the heart, as we'll see in just a moment. Because really what Chochmah is Talmud. That's being taught, being able to learn. Chochmah is the openness to be able to hear what other people have to say. That's why they go together, Talmid, Chocham. That really the wisdom of a great scholar is to be able to learn and to hear either what the Torah has to say in a book or what a teacher has to say in an interaction. Bina is once I have that information. Bina Salev is, it's not good enough for a person to take the information that they have been taught and just to distill it and hold on to it in its pristine original form. So we're told that we have to do that. Shmiras HaOizen, make sure that you've heard it correctly. Arichas Fosayim, make sure that it's stated correctly. But Binas HaLev means once you've got information, then it's very important that it doesn't stop at that particular point in time. So let's understand this from a different perspective, and you'll see that there's a theme now that runs through this cluster. The theme is that in order for us to learn Torah correctly, it has to be, as the Gemara calls it, Arucha b'chol evrei haguf. That in order for a person to learn Torah correctly, the Torah has to become part of the fiber of my being. Which is interesting. Most people expect the Torah should become part of my mind. It's information, ultimately it's wisdom. So where else do you put wisdom if not in your mind? Judaism says it's not as simple as that. The goal of Torah is that it actually becomes part and parcel of who we are. And that's why, one of the reasons, Arichas Fosayim, that's why we say the words, so that it becomes something that we have contributed to as well. It's not just that we're receiving it in the mind, but there's a physical action. In fact, the Gemara elsewhere says that in certain halachas, then arichas vasayim have a maisa, that moving your lips is actually considered action as opposed to dibur, because there are three main faculties: thought, speech, and action. And when you say something, when you verbalize something, it's actually in the category of action. It's no longer just in the category of speech, which is fascinating. And that means that the whole process of what it takes to speak, which is the movement of lips and the tongue and the teeth and the palate and the throat and the diaphragm and the lungs, all the various elements that allow the possibility of speech are now all included in this experience of learning Torah. By the way, and I don't mean this as flippantly, I mean it quite seriously, that's also why we tend to move when both learning and davening, is that our body should be engaged in the expression of Torah and in the experience of Torah. We say this in the davening on Shabbos, Kol atzmoisai toimarno Hashem yichamoicha, that every part of our body, every bone in our body should declare Hashem's greatness, and every bone in our body should absorb Hashem's Torah. So that's why Binas Halev is really important, because the way Hashem designed human beings is with multiple paradoxes. And we're going to look at one of them. One of the paradoxes of the human being is that we're very limited. It's good to know. And at the same time, very endowed with opportunity and with talent. That's the paradox of the human being. In other words, if you take Torah, for example, Torah is divine wisdom, and Hashem is infinite, therefore His wisdom is infinite. As the Rambam says, Hu v'chachmasai echad. Hashem and His wisdom are one, therefore if Hashem is infinite, His wisdom is infinite. We're finite, we don't have the tools to be able to actually grasp infinite. It's that simple. To put it differently, imagine if somebody would walk into the room and say, listen, I've got a very, very complex topic that I want to share with you today. It is so complex, you're not going to be able to get it into your handbag to take home. You'd say, that's ridiculous. That's not how you transport information. That's not how information works. It doesn't go into physical pouches, It's got to go into a brain. So in the same way as a brain is the correct tool to understand information, and your hands are not the correct tool to hold information, or a bag is not the correct tool to hold information, in the same way, a brain is not the correct tool to hold infinity. Just not the right tool. So on the one hand, you have Torah that is infinite, and therefore the human mind cannot really capture it. So therefore we have to be Talmud. We have to approach Torah from a perspective of we're always going to be learning, something which is completely beyond us, in the hope that Hashem will allow some of it to seep into our minds and we'll actually get it right. At the same time, He gave us a brain, which means that we're required to use that brain, which means technically that if two people have two different intellectual abilities, their mitzvah of learning Torah is actually different. Because the one person will fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah to the extent of their intellectual abilities, which for the other person may not even be the beginning of fulfilling the mitzvah because they haven't yet used their brain. So that's the paradox. On the one hand, we have to have the humility to accept that Torah is infinitely beyond us. And on the other hand, we also have to use our minds to understand to the best of our abilities, because those are the abilities that were given to us. Binas Halev. Binas Halev means it's got to become something which is so well understood in my mind that it becomes part of my heart. In other words, we all know, I'm sure you've heard this dozens of times, the old line, what is the difference between ignorance and apathy? So the answer is, I don't know and I don't care. And it's quite a profound message, because anything that I don't know about, I can't care about. So if somebody had to come to us today and say, what do you think of the financial situation in Djibouti? We're going to say, I don't know. I don't care. Not because I'm an insensitive person, but because I don't know anything about it. I can't care about it. There's a direct link between what goes on in our minds and what goes on in our hearts. And the better we understand something, the more likely it is that we'll have a meaningful emotional attachment to it. Binas Halev. That's the meaning of Binas Halev. Not just that Binas Halev is that I have to network and put together the different concepts that I've learned and see how they collate and how they correlate. Binas Halev means that when I truly understand something, I will feel differently as a result of understanding it. And that is an expectation of Torah, not to allow ourselves to retain Torah just as theoretical information, but to learn specifically with an insight of how will this impact and shift the way that I feel. Anybody knows that when we've learned Torah for a period of time, we actually start to feel differently about things that maybe the rest of the world doesn't even begin to imagine. We feel differently about Hashem controlling the world. We feel differently about our responsibilities. We feel differently about how to have control over our character traits and emotions, etc. So Binas Halev is a critical part of Torah, and that's what helps us to understand that Torah learning is never purely about capturing information. It is about transforming who we are. So that's our first cluster. A whole series of steps that we apply when we're learning with the intention that our learning is something that keeps us humble and shifts us fundamentally as people, both physically, ears and lips, and emotionally, that we become people who have a different kind of emotional attachment to the things that the Torah teaches. Once we know that, so we've now made the bridge to sentiment, to emotion, we can get into the next cluster, which is a series of feelings that a person is supposed to engage with while learning Torah. And they are be'ema, with awe, be'yira, with fear. Okay, so now we have to understand what the difference is between fear and awe. Ba'nava, with humility. Be'simcha, with joy. Be'tahara, with purity. So that's our next cluster of things that we have to work on. How do I feel about myself? How do I feel about the Torah learning? So ema and yira go together. Ema is a sense of awe. Yira is a sense of fear. What's the difference between awe and fear? And we're not bringing in the word pachad over here, because pachad is much more of a visceral, impulsive, responsive fear. That's not what we're describing over here. So can you think of a context where the word awe is an appropriate word? Ema.
It's always more like when you're so overwhelmed by something.
Good, that's a great word. Overwhelmed is an excellent word for ema. Ema is where the experience is so powerful that you're overwhelmed by the experience. So we're about to celebrate Shavuos and to go through the story again of Matan Torah. That was ema. That's how the Torah was given. The Gemara says, Ma lahalon, just like when the Torah was originally given, it was be'ema, over yira, over reses, over zeya. It was with awe and with fear and with trembling and with perspiration. So too, when we learn Torah, it's supposed to be with all of those factors. So ema is to be overwhelmed, to feel literally like we're in the presence of Hashem. In fact, it's very interesting that the commentaries on the Mishnah choose either the subject of this ema and yira to be Hashem, or the subject of this ema and yira to be your teacher. So to be in awe of Hashem, when we're learning Torah, to be in awe of Hashem, to recognize how incredible, and that's why the word overwhelming is a good word, how incredible it is that Hashem has given us this Torah. It should overwhelm us. We shouldn't like swagger in and say, hey, what's on the daf today? we should approach this with saying this is an incredible experience that Hashem has made himself accessible to us. Like the Gemara Shabbos tells us, the first word of the Ten Commandments, Anoichi, is an acronym for Ano, I, Nafshi, my soul, Ksavis, I have written, Yohavis, and given to you in the Torah. It means Hashem has given us access to something which we really don't deserve access to. It's way beyond our pay grade. And that should be our attitude to Torah, to sit there with this overwhelming sense of, wow. So when a person is in a state of awe, they're not afraid, they're overwhelmed. In other words, if you had somebody that was your lifelong hero, your whole life you wished you had the opportunity to meet them, when you met them, you'd be in a state of awe. You wouldn't be afraid of them. You'd just be so overwhelmed by their presence and by how big you've created them to be in your mind that you wouldn't actually know where to put yourself. So that's what we mean when we say be'ema, with this tremendous sense of overwhelmed awe. I mean, awe of Hashem. Yira is where you start thinking, am I actually worthy? So ema is the greatness of Hashem. Ema is the greatness of the teacher, because again, the two commentators or the two sets of commentators either attributed to Hashem or to the teacher. Yira is where I start to become afraid, am I going to actually be up to the task? Am I actually going to be able to master this or learn this information? Am I going to be able to shmiya sa'oz and listen closely to what's being said and get it right? Arichas ha'posayim, to be able to convey it appropriately. And the greatness of that is that when a person does feel that tinge of fear, it keeps them focused. But we'll see it's a tinge of fear, as we're going to see in just a moment, but it does keep us focused. People often ask about public speaking. What's it like to get up in front of a crowd of hundreds of people Do you still get nervous? And people often ask that question. Do you still get nervous in front of hundreds of people? It's a really good question. Most people don't want to get up in front of the crowd of hundreds of people. It's the last thing that they ever want to do. How often do you hear people say, I'm not a speaker. It's not my thing. When a person does get up to speak in front of a large crowd, you want them to feel just a tinge of fear, just a tinge of anxiety, because it helps performance, actually. When a person is complacent, they don't really deliver. You want that tension, you want that energy in the presentation, because having a little bit of fear, not that I'm afraid of the audience, not that I'm afraid I'll do a bad job, but just that I'm afraid that I'm not going to be on my game, that keeps me really focused. So Yira is on the student. It's the student saying, I'm worried, I'm not becoming preoccupied with anxiety, I'm not becoming overwhelmed by the possibilities of my own inadequacies, but I'm worried that I might miss something. I'm worried that I might not come back. So that level, that tinge of fear is what keeps a person on their toes, that they make sure to pay attention and they make sure to verify. The person is complacent, walks into the class and doesn't take in the information, and is quite happy to convey the information without fact-checking and verifying that it's actually correct. So that's why Amar, the sense of awe, the greatness of what's being presented, Yira, the fear that my own limitations might derail the process, and so therefore I've got to really be on top of my game. And that goes directly to the next word, anova, which is humility. There are no surprises to us that humility is very much associated with Torah learning. Why is it not a surprise to us? Because the ultimate representative of Torah is Moshe, and the ultimate representative of humility is Moshe. So that's no accident. They obviously go hand in hand. It must be because Moshe had this incredible sense of anova, of humility, therefore he was in a position to be able to receive the Torah properly. We can link this to a very well-known saying of the Gemara in Sota that says, Reish Lakish teaches that if a person is arrogant, what does Hashem say? Ein ani v'hu yecholin ladur ba'isir makom. I and he cannot be in the same space. What does it mean? Hashem can't be in a space. What does it mean? Hashem's everywhere. We all know the song, right? Up, up, down, down. Hashem's everywhere. What do you mean Hashem's not going to be in the space? Is Hashem checking out? Is that like somebody who gets a little bit offended and says, well, if you're going to dominate the conversation, I'm out of here? Like, what does it mean? It doesn't mean Hashem's not there. So what it means is, there's a saying from the Kotzker Rebbe, where he says, where is Hashem? Wherever you allow him in. That's his teaching, right? Wherever you allow him. So if you don't allow him in, he's not there. What does that mean? So we all know exactly what it means, because we all have in our lives people who are important to us, but sometimes, let's say, for example, a child hits that wonderful adolescent stage where you are an insignificant human. Nothing that you say is right, and you know nothing about the world, and you're actually an embarrassment, and you have to drop them a block away from school because you should never be seen with them alive. So what do you say? What do you say in that context to a teenage child? You and I can't live in the same space. It was very tempting. You want to start charging them board and lodging. So what are you actually saying? What you're saying is, well, I'll always have a relationship with you, but if you're not allowing me in, you won't feel that relationship. You won't have that connection. Hashem will always have a relationship, obviously, with every single thing that he created, whether it be human or non-human. It's not going to make a difference, and Hashem is always present and always there. Question is, will it be something that we're conscious of? Will it be a relationship, as we call it in Torah, panim keneged panim, face-to-face relationship, or will it be panim keneged oref, like the Navi Yeshaya says, panu alai oref alai panim, that the Jewish people turn their back. The oref is the back of your neck, which is the same letters as the word paroi. Ha-oref is the same as paroi. So you've turned your rebellious side, like Paroi says, I don't know God and I don't want anything. We've turned that towards Hashem. Okay, so Hashem says that I'm going to still be looking at you. You'll be looking away. When it comes to learning Torah, we want to obviously get Hashem's Torah, not our watered-down, corrupted version of His Torah. And incidentally, that's why we're so, you'll notice, so on guard about organizations that try and teach principles that are from Torah without being dedicated to Torah. Because then the information may sound Torah-esque, but it's actually not Torah. Because without humility, without accepting that this is the absolute word of Hashem, which is Hashem's infinite wisdom, and therefore I have to absolutely accept it, whether I understand it or not. If I don't do that, what I'm getting in is not Torah. It is information like Torah, looks similar to Torah, but it's not Torah. And as anybody knows, there's a huge difference between a diamond and a cheap knockoff cubic. They may look the same, they're absolutely not the same. Something might appear to be Torah, but if it's not actually Torah, then it's absolutely valueless. So we need to have humility. Humility is to hear the message of the Torah rather than to impose our own interests or biases onto that message. I'll tell you a beautiful story just to wrap that up. The third Rebbe of Chabad, the Tzemach Tzedek, had a way that he would learn Gemara. He'd learn the whole page of Gemara and spend hours working out what the Gemara is saying. And then he'd go back and he'd learn the whole page again with the opinion of Rashi, understanding exactly how Rashi's commentary explains the Gemara. And then he'd go back and relearn the Gemara to be clear why Rashi's interpretation was correct and not his. Right? That's another, that's humility. That's to say, I'm not learning the Torah the way I would like the Torah to be. I'm learning the Torah knowing that we have a tradition that our great sages wrote their commentaries with insight and with connection. And so therefore, that is the way that the Torah is supposed to be learned. When we have that kind of anova, we have that kind of humility, that's when we can really accept Torah. Beautiful place for us to round off today. We still have Simcha and Tara, which is part of this cluster to do, which please God will tack on to the next cluster. But it's a beautiful place to pause today because we're about to celebrate Shavuos. We're about to receive the Torah again. So this is a great reminder for us that the key to receiving the Torah is absolute anava, humility. The only problem with this now is